So while my panelists come up on stage, maybe I just say a warm word of appreciation for our Vice President Georgieva for these really very inspiring and hard-hitting remarks this morning, which got us off to an excellent start. So, hi. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this first panel entitled Performance in the Public Sector. Theory and practice. Also, a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining us via the live stream. So I'm still missing some of my panelists. Maybe, Commissioner, you want to join me on this side. So Vice President Georgieva rightfully emphasized this morning the importance of smart spending and impact on growth, jobs, and of course also on innovation. And this indeed is the perfect segue to this session that will focus very much on performance-based budgeting. Of course, it sounds like a common sense and a no-brainer, but linking budgeting and funds on one hand to measurable results and impact on the other does not always happen, especially in the public sector. Now, we're here today to assess how well a performance-based approach is working, both at the EU and the member state level. And in fairness, let me say, it is harder in the public sector to prove results. Government is a more complex backdrop than, let's say, a company or a corporation. And it is an area where there are few indicators and benchmark for success. But that makes it all the more important that we pursue a budget focused on results. With the amounts of money that we are talking about, we can move the world if we get spending right. As the Vice President said, we can deliver for our citizens. And we can deliver immeasurable results, and we can prepare for a future that will undoubtedly bring even more crises and challenges. I thought it was absolutely correct when the Vice President spoke very eloquently about the shifting priorities and that we need to be able to respond to them. We're seeing this now with the refugee crisis. Now, I have with me here today a fabulous panel to discuss performance in the public sector. The topic itself will be introduced by Dr. Mark Robinson, partner at PFM Results Consulting and a member of the OECD Advisory Board on Budgeting and Public Expenditure. Now, Dr. Robinson, you are, by all accounts, one of the world's top experts on performance budgeting. You have published very widely in the field, and you are also an advisor to many governments. So I really couldn't think of a better person to start us off here today with a keynote of about 10 minutes. This is another thing I might mention. We're running a little bit behind, so I'll be very, very strict with my panelists and insist that you stick to your allotted time. So 10 minutes for you to speak about performance-based budgeting and maybe also reflect a little bit about how the European Commission is doing in this regard. Dr. Robinson, the floor is yours.
Well, good morning. This is working, yes. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Dr. Mittler, for that very kind invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here today. I've been asked to inject an external perspective on the issue that we're discussing today. And I want to be very selective in focusing on a couple of the very many issues which arise in relation to implementing and really making effective a performance budgeting system. The first thing which is obviously crucial is to get the design of your performance budgeting system right. Now, on these issues of design, of implementation, we now have a wealth of international experience running over decades. And this is something which the European Commission, I think, is in an ideal position to be able to exploit fully. In relation to performance-based budgeting, the obvious starting point is that there is no single There's no one model of performance budgeting system. It's a question of designing your performance budgeting system to suit the circumstances, and in particular as a starting point for distinguishing between performance budgeting systems which is designed to operate just within a specific sector, such as education or health, and those which aim to cope with a whole budgeting system such as you find in a government or in an organisation such as the European Commission, and making sure that when you choose that design you don't get these choices confused. In relation to a government-wide performance budgeting system, the sort that would be appropriate for European Commission, for example, the basics are pretty straightforward. What one should aim for is a system which does not try to mechanically link performance to funding, but rather falls into the broad category of a program budgeting system, or if you like to express it differently, a system which aims to make budgeting performance informed. In other words, one which firstly structures the budget around the results that you're trying to achieve, which uses performance information, indicators and evaluation, and which tries to integrate performance considerations into funding decisions, both so as to align money and priorities more effectively, as has been emphasised here today, but also to encourage and put pressure on agencies to maximise their effectiveness and efficiency. In addition, you can have various add-ons, such as the use of performance targets linked to the budget, which I will come to later on. Above all, though, you have to avoid some of the mistakes that have been made elsewhere. In particular, the attempt to build at a government-wide level or a European Commission-wide level a mechanical link between funding and results. This is a mistake which some countries around the world, such as Australia and New Zealand, made in past decades. And it's been comprehensively demonstrated that while this might work in specific sectors, such as hospital systems, it does not work at the level of an entire budget. The next fundamental problem, having got the design right, is that of how to ensure that performance really does influence the allocation of resources, that it really influences who gets what. Because if you look at international experience, it has to be frankly admitted that in the majority of countries that have supposedly introduced is a budget document stuffed full of performance indicators. You see, performance plans, you see performance reports, you see thousands of pages of this sort of material. But if you ask, to what extent does this performance information really affect who gets what in the budget, the answer is very little indeed. So in implementation and design, there's nothing more fundamental, in my opinion, than making sure that you don't end up in this situation, making sure that performance really counts in terms of who gets what. There are many aspects to avoiding this fate. Let me just touch on two. The first is to not make the error of just assuming that because you've got performance information that this is going to be used in budget decisions. The French, with their world-famous LOLF performance budgeting system introduced more than a decade ago, a very well-designed system in many ways, when this was reviewed a couple of years ago, they realised there was a basic design fault, that during budget preparation, the only thing that was discussed in the bilateral negotiations between the Ministry of Finance and the spending agencies was money. There was no performance dimension to the discussion about budget allocation. something which they and a number of other countries have sought to change by making sure that a discussion about performance is part of the bilateral budget discussion and part of resource allocation. The other crucial thing one can mention is the need to reduce barriers to resource allocation. And typically these barriers are many. They are, for example, budget systems which tie or commit certain funds to programs irrespective of the degree of effectiveness. They are civil service employment regimes where it is impossible to either move staff from non-performing programs to other areas or even get people to change jobs. Just the other night on television there was coverage of the reforms that Matteo Renzi has underway to address exactly this issue in a place like Italy. If you have a traditional, very rigid civil service system of the sort Italy has had up to date, you can forget about introducing performance in a meaningful way into resource allocation. The other major challenge that has to be faced squarely is in a way something which our moderator has already referred to in saying that introducing a performance dimension is often harder in the public sector than it is in the private sector. One can go even further than that and say that it is much harder at a government-wide level and in particular at a supranational level such as the European Commission than it is, for example, at a local government level or in a particular sector such as education or hospitals. Why is this? Because of the complexity of the services being delivered, because of the complex and long-term nature of the outcomes which interventions such as research or economic development are trying to achieve. And we have to face these difficulties squarely, and in doing so we have to avoid the sort of negativism that you often see, which is people saying, look, you know, these interventions are so complex, measurement is so difficult that this whole exercise of trying to inject performance is just a waste of time. Why bother? This is, I think, the wrong approach. But equally, we have to avoid glossing over these problems. It remains the case that we have to grapple with the problem of long time leads. Outcomes are what matters most, but it is true they're often only achieved in the medium and long term, and they're difficult to measure. It's difficult to separate the external factors from the effects of our own intervention. What do we need to do about this? There are a range of things. One is greater clarity about the outcomes that we're intending to achieve. You'll forgive me saying so, but when I look through European Commission documents and I see references to the cohesion policies, to the intended objective being one of strengthening the cohesion between European Union members, to me that's vague. A starting point is to be more specific about what that means. Does it mean reducing disparities of economic development? What does it mean? And from that, what sorts of outcomes should we be measuring? Outcome measurement needs to be improved as well. If you look at something like research, it's important to measure the outputs, such as scientific publications, such as patents, but measuring outcomes through measures such as the rate of commercialisation of patents is extremely important as well and is often neglected. Precisely because many outcomes will remain ultimately unmeasurable or poorly measurable, impact evaluation is very important. And finally, we have to remember that output measurement and output quality measurement, measuring the quality of the services or interventions, is extremely important as well, and things like user satisfaction are crucial there. Let me finish up, and this has just been a selection, a very brief selection of a number of issues in this complex area, by saying that while the basics of an appropriate system for a body such as the European Commission that is a performance-informed budgeting system based on programs, is very clear and essential. There are some bells and whistles, some add-ons you can build into such a system. And the performance reserve idea, the notion of a certain amount of money there as a reward for good performance, is an excellent example of that. I congratulate the Budget Director General for this initiative. There are other add-ons which need to be designed very carefully, and I focus on one in particular, which is performance targets. We have to be very careful about performance target setting. There's often a tendency to want to set performance targets linked to the budget for everything, and I want to caution against this. You have to be careful in setting targets to not set more than you can monitor and manage, to not set targets for things which you have very little control over, and to very clearly distinguish between objectives and targets. The time is very brief. I fear that I've already exceeded it, so I will leave my intervention at that point. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. As you were speaking, I looked again at the name of the session and I realized how cleverly it was named, namely theory and practice, because of course you're absolutely right that in theory and on paper we may have the right systems in place, but in practice they oftentimes don't deliver what we expect of them. So I'm very grateful for that very hard-hitting and useful intervention here this morning. Now, our next speaker is Kevin Cardiff, a member of the European Court of Auditors. Mr. Cardiff, as part of your responsibilities, you have been engaged in a number of projects related to the performance of the European Union, and you're the member responsible for various performance audits and for the court's landscape review of the EU accountability and public audit arrangements. Something tells me you are a much feared man in some quarters of the Commission. Now, Mr. Cardiff, this makes you the perfect person to comment on today's discussion with a critical eye, but hopefully also recognizing the effort that the Commission is making in improving its performance. And I would say that this conference speaks for itself in this regard. And Mr. Cardiff, the floor is yours. Let me mention 5 minutes maximum.
Thank you. I'm in fear myself if I breach the 5 minutes. Well, the Commissioner at the start said that she was surprised to see so many people because budgeting is regarded as a boring topic. Well, audit is even more so. And it's boring in large part because we say the same things over and over and over and over and over again, every year. We change the audit, we do this project and that project, and yet we say the same thing. It's boring, and it's tiring, and there's a reason. The problem is that really good people, it's the predicament of public administration everywhere. We get together, very often really good people, we give them a task, and we don't seem to get the right outcome. We don't get exactly what we think we should get. And why is that? It's because when we put those people together, we say performance is important, but that's not what we actually demand. We demand something different. We demand that money is spent fast. We demand that money is spent in particular places that are more politically relevant. We demand that we have performance expectations of the Commission, perhaps, but we don't have the same expectation of each individual project that the Commission is funding. We demand that the Commission ensures that the European Union budget is well spent, but 80% of it is spent by Member State authorities. And if you go to the Member State level, you might find that an individual Member State is spending its agriculture budget through 15 or 20 other bodies. So it is maybe a little folly that we always expect the highest level budgetary authority, the Commission in this case, or in a national system, the national government, we always expect the highest level national body or supranational body to deliver the performance without spending the time to ensure that performance is part of the process, part of the expectation and part of the demand through the whole process, from top to bottom. And that's what we find when we do our performance audits. We did in 2013 and 2014 something like 42 separate audits of Commission programs, and we found that there were flaws. But very often those flaws arise from that difference between expectation at the supranational EU level, expectation at the member state level, and what actually happens on the ground. We don't see very often that an individual project is likely to be aligned well with the high-level objectives. We do see nowadays that the performance focus in the Commission's work is improving. But the annual activity reports, for example, are more focused. The performance information is routinely now included in programme statements and management plans and so forth. But it's not yet sufficient. There's a lot, frankly, even at the Commission level, even having complemented their abilities, there's quite a lot more to be done in terms of making the kinds of engaging the kinds of measurement systems that will really tell you about performance rather than about the amount of money that was spent, whether it was spent in a timely fashion and so forth. So we have to build a system from top to bottom that focuses on performance as its main element. Error is, of course, important, but if there is a lot of attention to performance, probably we'll have a lower error rate also. Often individual program design is hampered by a lack of clarity about objectives. Or objectives are so broad that they don't really incentivize any particular outcome. If you have a program and there are 20 different objectives, and the spending people are allowed to pick from all of those 20, then in effect you incentivize nothing. Nothing is the priority if there are 20 priorities. Result monitoring overall is weak. Result information may be poor. We need to deal with that. Often EU added value is difficult to identify, but our big problem in a lot of program level is often dead weight, spending money on things that would happen anyway. So I have just come to my conclusion, and I've just come to the end of 4 seconds. My final point is this. If we really want the Commission to change what it does, we must change the demands we make of the Commission. If we really want a performance outcome, then at the political level, at the member state level, we have to demand performance from the Commission rather than that they try to achieve 20 or 30 different other agendas rather than that one.
Thank you, Mr. Cardiff. That was extremely interesting. And like the previous speaker, Dr. Robinson, you also called for more clarity in the objectives, which I think is something that is resonating very much here. So thank you for that contribution. Next up are commissioners who have responsibility for 2 directorates with very sizable budgets. We will first hear from Corina Creţu, who oversees regional policy. Commissioner, in the current multi-annual financial framework from 2014 to 2020, the funding of DG Regional Affairs amounts to 351 billion euros. That's a sizable amount of money, and if spent to maximum effect, could have a profound impact on Europe. But the question I have is, how do you know when you have the right balance between simplification on the one hand and control on the other? Because, of course, we all still need control. And how do you measure impact and success? And how do you really put performance-based budgeting into practice? That must be a formidable challenge, and I'm very glad that you will tell us how you do this in 5 minutes.
more longer speech, but I would like to focus. Although I think it would have been very important to speak more about this important event, because it's very important, as you said, how we spend money. As you know, I am responsible for the coordination of European structural and investment funds, what we say is the ESI fund, which is Union's main investment tool. You said 315 billion, but together with co-financing for member states, it's more than 600 billions. And of course, we celebrated this year's 40 years from ERDF, Regional Development Fund, and we can see the differences from where our member states started 40 years ago, others just 10 years ago or less. But the impact of the structural funds you see everywhere. We will have almost 1 year of our mandate, and I was in 20 countries already. And of course, I am ready to share my experience from all these countries, because every member state is different. They have different needs. They have different priorities. And you know very well that it took more than 3 years to agree the concepts and terminology and provide a legal framework that covered all 28 member states. But as I said, the impact of our funds is in every member states, but we still have lack of coordination between funds, overlapping, and other error rates. And of course, people from European Court of Auditors reminding us every day, and I really think it's our duty to solve this problem. We traditionally our debates are on inputs. In other words, amounts agreed to be invested in member states. And of course, we also judge very much on the rate of absorption. And of course, we will not have an impact without absorbing funds, but I think the absorption is not a guarantee of impact. And I already seen in many member states this rushing for an absorption rate. As you know, I have established a task force for better implementation for the countries that had less than 60% of absorption. And from my point of view, these countries that are threatening by having losing some money at the end of the year, because it is the end of the budgetary period, should have in these 3 months should keep the implementation of the funds of the first political priority. But we also have many examples of money that are spent legally, but still not have the effect we want, especially in terms of jobs creation, which I think for the next programming period should be a very important indicator. So we are very determined as a Commission and to change these things. And it's an implementing phase here. We have more to change. As you said, in theory, many of us are very good, but in practice, we have to tell to the member states and to the managing authorities that there are some risks to take, and they have to take this risk. I come from Vienna. Yesterday, we celebrated 25 years of cross-border cooperation. And I am very proud of what European funds achieved on the cross-border cooperation. It was very moving for me yesterday to be at the border from Austria to Slovakia and visit a bilingual kindergarten. And I know very well that many people died before '89 on this border. There were many Eastern Europeans, not only Slovaks. They wanted to seek a better life, and of course, in the forest and in the Danube, many people died. Also, it's a very sensitive border between Frankfurt and Slubice, between Poland and Germany. And for me, it's very emotional when I see that it's like everyday life to go from one one country to another to see an opera or to see a movie and come back in the same. It is something unbelievable for me. My nieces, for instance, they never believed that I was not able to go to Sofia from Bucharest or to Budapest. So I think we should be very critical of the errors, but also we should be very grateful of what European Union's brought to us. And for me personally, it is very sad to see that there are voices that are saying that we need to put another scars of our maps and building walls. I said yesterday very clear to my services that it might seem that some of the countries would like to use European money for that, and I'm ready to ask them to withdraw the money if any member states would like to use European funds for building bridges. I think it's unacceptable. So we have to stick with our priorities. You know that many countries, they still have this obsession of highways, which is a very important thing for infrastructures, but we have to look at the other countries that they also had decades ago these obsessions, and we try to convince them that we have to focus on small and medium-sized enterprises, more on research, and my colleague Carlos is here to explain you how much research is important for development of European Union as a whole and closing the disparities between regions. And you have asked me about simplification, and I would like to say briefly that we have launched, we had a contest of the summer. We established a high-level group of simplification. We have 12 people from all across Europe. The chair will be Vice President Mr. Kallas, and next week we'll have the first meeting. We'll start to make a study, because what you said is very important. If I go to European Parliament, because I saw many people from European Parliament, it's one thing to go to regional policy, and it's another thing to go to the budgetary committee and to the committee. And of course, we are responsible for how the money is spent, and I think it's really very important to find the best balance between simplification, because I know so many beneficiaries that they don't want anymore to apply and to seek for European money because they think it's too complicated and too bureaucratic, but in the same time, of course, we have to have zero tolerance to fraud, and we have to be aware of the importance of European money. And I come back to say that this regional policy, it's under shared management, shared responsibility with member states and regions. We have approved almost all operational programs, but now the ball is in the court of member states, because we cannot design from Brussels mature programs. We cannot design projects from here. It's entirely the responsibility of member states which kind of programs they have, and we just offer, of course, exchange of good practices. And we are always ready to talk with member states, but I think it's very important that member states to take also the full responsibility for their immense challenge they have in front of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. As you were speaking, I could sense how challenging it must be to deal with so many different member states, all the regions, and the complexity of the projects that you fund. So it's a formidable task that you are undertaking, and we're very grateful that you're sharing your experience here with us today. Now, our final speaker is Carlos Moedas, Commissioner for Research, Science and Innovation. Commissioner, you also budget period 2014-2020. So Horizon 2020 amounts to some 80 billion euros, and it is by all accounts among the, if not the largest publicly funded research program in the world. Your recipients are, of course, top-level scientists who are by definition often work anywhere in the world. Excessive bureaucracy, one is not only likely to stifle some of the innovation that you might get out of an EU-funded project, but it can actually lead scientists to leave to places where the framework conditions are considered better and there's more flexibility, etc. So this must be a formidable challenge that you are grappling with. And in general, how does Horizon 2020 deal with this question of simplification and control, which comes up again and again in this discussion? If you will have 5 minutes for your response, and very much looking forward to it.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. And I'm very pleased to see so many people around, and people from the court, people, honorable members of the parliament, and everyone so interested in this subject. You know, I'm a bit of a strange animal because I was educated as an engineer, as someone that actually loves science. But then I learned how to actually love budgets, because then my life actually became more into economics and finance. And then it was very easy at the beginning, because we all talking about theories and how can we measure outcomes and outputs. And then I went to national government. And it was a shock. I mean, it was a shock for different reasons, but it was a shock in terms of really how unfair are actually based. Unfair that we all talk about modern ways of doing it, but in a lot of governments what you see is that budgets are based on legacy, they're based on political demand. And so the good students, the good ones, are normally the ones that actually pay more than others, because they are the good students. And so I got very interested at the time to actually reflect upon this matter and think, how can I help changing these? And how can I actually look at it in the eye of an engineer looking at economics? And so one of the things that I think is actually that you have to acknowledge when you look at budgets and when you look at this dichotomy in between outputs and inputs is a little bit what in quantum physics we call the Heisenberg principle, which for the ones that are not engineers probably don't know about this principle, but it's a quite interesting one that says you cannot measure simultaneously the position and the speed of a particle. So at the same time, it's impossible to measure where you find the position of the particle and what's the speed of that particle. And that's, I think, really the core of the question here, is that we talk about outputs, about measuring outputs, but then sometimes these outputs, they are in conflict with each other. We can say that, as we were saying, I mean, if you're a good scientist, you do a lot of publications. But then if the incentive is just to do publications, is that the right incentive? Are those publications very good? And then you say, no, so let's change that to patents and let's do a lot of patents. But is it about doing a lot of patents, or is it about doing patents that actually change the way we do products? And so I think that the point that we are, which is this tipping point that I sometimes share here a lot in ideas with Anne, is this tipping point where I think we have a solution because we can have hope in the future. And the tipping point that we are is basically that we are at the tipping point of getting the information system and the big data to work with each other. And I think that what I really would like to discuss with you here, and I could go through what we've done and not, and the question of Anne, but I was trying to think a little bit broader in terms, how can we actually use big data to transform the way we do budgeting? Because it's true that we have to be careful with the targets and the performance, but we can actually, with the information that we have today, we can do a much better job. Because it's not about one indicator, it's about a meta-analysis of a lot of indicators. And I think what's lacking in the way we think about budgets is this meta-analysis of the outputs. that would be then our outcomes and the outcomes that we cherish. So for us in research, it has been a big journey, a journey to get it to how to use this data, how to get more simplification, and how to get actually to a group of people that actually, instead of actually just managing the budget, think about what the budget should be and what we want to do about this budget. So we went into the simplification in Horizon 2020 that you all know and heard about it, and I think is a major step for getting those analyses of that data in a way that you understand. Most, and I would say that all the transactions that we have in Horizon 2020 are now electronic. So before it was interesting because you would ask questions, you would ask a scientist, do you think that the funding you received was good for you? And the answer, of course, would be yes, it is, right? And so it's not a question that you can ask. But then now you have the data to analyze if actually the question and the answer are the ones that actually have a meaning. Then we transferred all the budget management time to focus on the point of the priorities and objectives, and the meta have this conversation looking.
Thank you. That was extremely interesting. And yesterday, when I was preparing for this session, I put down a couple of topics we might want to talk about in case no one asks any questions, which I'm sure is not going to happen. And data was one of them, because, I mean, obviously, so much around data analytics than there used to be. So, who wants to ask a question? We have a little bit of time to hear your interventions. Don't be shy. So the people who are interested in budgeting and auditing are not only boring, but also very shy. So, okay, then maybe we'll just have a little bit of a discussion here among our panelists. As I said, in preparing for this, I thought about good practices, and I'd be interested what your response to this is. And a couple of years ago, I had the great privilege of working quite closely with Andreas Schleicher, who probably many of you know as really the genius behind the PISA study that the OECD does. And up until then, education was only measured by input. So I'm half German. I went to school in Germany, and what a shock it was when Germans that actually spend quite generously on schooling performed rather poorly when it was measured what this money that goes into education actually delivers. So the larger point I'm making, maybe there is too much emphasis on input and not enough on output and outcome. Any responses from our panelists? Dr. Robinson, you must have come across this. You work with the OECD.
Well, you know, education, as you say, really is a classic example of the often get to measuring and focusing on results appropriately in the context of reforms, but also more generally in many countries, because, you know, traditionally the focus in education was on things such as class size. The assumption was that the smaller the class size was, the better the education would be. Things like equity of education, which would always be measured with things like participation rates of female students or undergrad or rural disadvantaged students and so on, but never on actual outcomes. And this has been the big revolution over recent years, and it's been a revolution that's been in the face of bitter resistance. We've got to be frank, from things like teachers' trade unions. And also in the face of many of the sorts of pseudo-arguments which are often thrown up against reforms in performance budgeting. You know, outcomes are too difficult to measure. External factors are play too much of a role for us to be able to measure the difference which our education is making versus, for example, the social background of the children. But these really have all been essentially revealed to be fallacious. In the education area, we've made huge advances in being able to develop things like so-called value-added league tables, which actually systematically separate the external factors, such as the social economic background of the kid, from the impact which education is actually happening. So in many ways, education, led partly by people like Andreas Schleicher and others, is a case study, a positive case study of what can in fact be done in these sorts of areas.
Anyone else would like to respond? And before you do, I owe an apology to at least two people in the room. Apparently, the way to ask questions is not to raise your hands, but to fill out a little form here. And two people in the audience do that. So to you, I apologize.
The point really is that we don't have a way to actually to create performance targets and outputs that actually are the ones that you cannot trick. I mean, everyone will try to trick the system. And I think that when I was talking about the idea of the meta-analysis is really how you can basically counter-attack any kind of tricking to the system. And in the education system, I think that that's exactly a very good example. And the example that you were talking about, that today is proven that the class size is actually has nothing to do with the performance, and that's a bigger class size actually have very good results. I think that's a good example how you can use in the wrong way one target and one output, and I think it's an excellent example, and the OECD has done a great job, and so I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Commissioner, can I ask a follow-up question? The European Research Council is actually oftentimes held up as a good example of spending. Why is that the case?
I think that the case is actually because you actually let the scientists do their job. And I think that the European Research Council is the example of how you should actually invest in science and fundamental science, which is you just let it be a bottom-up approach, and the scientists should focus on science. And so that's, I think, the big reason that I'm actually launching the idea of creation of what I'll call the idea of an European Innovation Council, because I think in Europe you don't have the same kind of structure where the innovator can go to get a total bottom-up approach. And so the idea of the European Research Council is probably really one of the best European ideas. Is really to the point where you have an approach where the scientists can focus on the job, and you don't have to limit the scientist by telling them what to do. He knows better than you what to do. And the result of the European Research Council has been several Nobel Prizes. It has been the invention of graphene. It has been Dr. Edward Moses with the Nobel Prize of Medicine last year. So we really know that we have to have this balancing between control and trust, but you have to trust the scientists that they know what they're doing. And then you have to actually control the way they're spending the money, but not control exactly what they do. And I think that's the big difference, that we do not want to control what scientists do. We want to be sure that the money is well spent, but you cannot control, you're not, as a policymaker, able to control that result.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that with us. Commissioner Cretu also wanted to say.
Thank you very much. As you know, we have tried to adapt our regional policy to this performance budgeting, and the Regional Development Fund finance a wide range of research and development and innovation actions, such as of research infrastructures, and of course we put a lot of emphasis on commercialization of the research results, because as you know, many scientists, they do science, but this should have, from our point of view, a result in the life of the people and technology transfer and so on. And these actions are very often different, but anyhow, always they are complementary to the actions financed from Horizon 2020. But I would like to say that, to add what Carlos said, that it's very important, and I hope this kind of events will inspire also national authorities to introduce or to align their own performance budgeting process to the EU approach. I think it's very important to have also very clear national involvement to our efforts, because without going hand in hand with national authorities, we will not have the results we would like to have.
Excellent. Thank you. Should we, because I see a woman who raised her hand. I'm delighted to see. Leave it to a woman to break the ice. I don't know if we have a microphone.
Yeah, we have to.
Okay, thank you very much. Edith. Thank you very much. Edith Peters from Austria. I have a question, and I feel a sort of very deep respect vis-à-vis scientists, and I ask myself, we trust them, this is what I understand, but how do you measure the results of scientists? This is the one thing, and one question to Commissioner Cretu. I'm wondering, why did you visit yesterday not the Hungarian border? Maybe the Austrians didn't give you the possibilities, but it would have been very interesting, I guess. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before we come back to our commissioners, anyone else? And I have to say here to our friends who are organizing, officially we should stop now, but we started almost 15 minutes late. So with your permission, I'll go on a couple of minutes more. There's a gentleman right over there. Please introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Tim Bouting. I work for the Netherlands House for Education and Research. And I have a quick question about the Horizon 2020 budget. So we started out with 80 billion. In the negotiations, it came down to 72.5. Then came the European Fund for Strategic Investment. It was cut again with 2.2 billion. Now there's an internal document leaked by Politico, which said that 2.2 million will be used from Horizon 2020 money for a corporate communication campaign, 400,000 from the Erasmus Plus program. And this is all beyond the Council's attempts to cut the budget of Horizon 2020 every year during the yearly budget negotiations. To use the words of Kurt Ketelare, is this a lemon that's being squeezed every year? And when will this stop?
Before we come to you, Commissioner, we'll see if anyone else wants to intervene. This will be the last round, so if you want to say something, say it now. Don't come to me in the coffee break and complain that I didn't call on you. Okay, the third question is also from the audience. I don't know from whom. It's anonymous. How to prevent performance-based budgeting from becoming government talking to itself instead of an instrument of transparency and accountability. So with that, we do one last round among the panelists. Let me see how we're doing time-wise. Maybe you have 2 minutes each. Who wants to start? Mr. Cardiff?